Private cloud's in the news. Private cloud is amazing, but private cloud is not just virtualization. Find out what the difference is and why you might need to manage your costs to make sure that everything makes sense and you don't end up with a $40 million bill for a new AI data center. Join us on this week's Tech Field Day podcast. Welcome to the Tech Field Day podcast, where we bring together a group of IT technical experts to discuss a single idea about key topics in the industry. This podcast features a variety of perspectives from members of the Tech Field Day delegate community and is often recorded in association with one of our events. Tech Field Day is part of the Futurum Group, and this podcast is also published on our sister company's site, Textron TV. On this episode, as we head into our next Cloud Field Day event, we'll be discussing how private cloud is not just virtualization 4.0. Before the discussion, let's meet who's on the panel today. Mike.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Graff. I'm currently Infrastructure Architecture Director over at Dolby Laboratories based in San Francisco. My role is around cloud operations, cloud governance, as well as just kind of general infrastructure architecture for my organization. And glad to be here.
All right. I guess I'll go next. I'm Jon Hildebrand. You can call me an independent contractor at the moment, doing a variety of different things for different companies. But in my past experience, I've been mostly a systems architect, utilizing a lot of large enterprises, especially from, if you want to call it, virtualization 1.0, maybe, depending upon where we're at right now.
And I'm Alastair Cooke, an event lead here at Tech Field Day with a long background of teaching VMware training courses and then AWS training courses and all things data center infrastructure and compute infrastructure. And as we're heading into Cloud Field Day, we noticed that there's quite a lot of on-premises infrastructure in our Cloud Field Day. And so my focus for Cloud Field Day has always been on the enterprise reality of hybrid multi-cloud. And so some of that cloud is on-premises, but it's not just virtualization on-premises. It's not good enough to just say, I can deliver you a virtual machine and there's an API to deliver a virtual machine. That's not what I consider to be a real cloud. For me, my paradigm for thinking about clouds comes from the AWS trainer background, that cloud is about enabling a developer to build and deploy applications rapidly and to make changes to those applications rapidly. And the ability to then do that on different platforms, be they on premises or in public cloud, is really where I see that hybrid multi-cloud story turning up. Mike, you had some thoughts around what hybrid cloud really means, how it's useful and how it's different from just having virtualization.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we talk about virtualization 4.0, right, as a premise, I mean, for me, when I think of, kind of the legacy approach where we were using something like a traditional hypervisor like VMware, if we were on-premises infrastructure, it was not really managed like a cloud, right? The cloud paradigm of, REST APIs and being able to call those to manage your infrastructure. Some of the legacy vendors have adopted that, but I think what we're going to see this week from Oxide and some of the other vendors is more of that, like, let's manage it like it's a real cloud and give the same kind of experience to the builders that they're getting from the cloud providers.
And we saw some sort of parallels to this as one of the ways that we see private cloud happening is cloud providers actually extending their reach down to on-premises with, and you mentioned, AWS Outposts and Azure Hybrid Cloud, HCI, whatever they're currently branding it, and of course, Google's Anthos. So the major cloud providers definitely want to have their solution, their tin in one form or another in your data center and using the same APIs to deploy, but it's not necessarily what we're seeing customers deploying. Jon, have you had some experience with people deploying things beyond virtualization as an on-premises cloud?
Yeah. I mean, we're getting to the point right now that applications exist outside of the VM construct. So, containerization is definitely starting to become very popular. I mean, if you think for the most part, many applications that were born in the cloud and due to repatriation, they're moving them back into a data center at this point, like Netflix, as an example. They basically have been moving that application, but developing it still as if it were in that public cloud mantra. if you want to call it that. So yeah, we're seeing applications shift all over the place, mostly for $ reasons. I think the pandemic put us in the open wallets of the pandemic are no longer open anymore for the cloud bills. And we have to have a serious look at where the money's going as far as where the resources are being put for these applications that are key to businesses.
Yeah, I think people really want to manage, like I said earlier, they really want to manage these on-premises estates the same way they've been managed with cloud. No one wants to go back to the old way of doing it. And your point about Kubernetes or serverless is really spot on, I think, John. Like, people are wanting to move away from these monolithic environments. They want to be using containers. They want to be able to manage those containers in the same way that they've been managing them in their clouds. I wonder, like, the repatriation thing is interesting to me because I always feel like you hear a lot about it, but I wonder how much is actually happening beyond the people who have those massive, like, 7-figure cloud bills. I don't know what your experience has been.
Well, I could basically state that I've worked with some service providers that have done quite a bit of repatriation for customers that are out there, mostly because, well, let's be honest, Broadcom has rocked data center infrastructure for the most part, with whatever you want to call it. But the point is that folks don't associate virtualization just with VMware anymore. And many other stacks exist out there to be able to provide you that developer-like feel for application development and application deployment. Shoot, even for the most part, if you think of something like Red Hat OpenShift as an example, you can do both virtualization and containerization and put the workloads next to each other, because as we know, any cloud-based workload, latency is the killer. So the smaller the distance, the quicker the application's going to respond. And don't even get me going on, I know Stephen will kill me for this, but mainframes in large enterprises, they still exist in data centers. And if you want to access that historical data that is in those things and put a new application spin on that, latency is going to be the killer. So to lessen the latency, you put these things in your data center from this point on.
Absolutely. We're seeing much more discussion, in particular of Red Hat OpenShift virtualization, not just Red Hat OpenShift as a Kubernetes distribution. I think that is absolutely being driven by people's desire to have an alternative to renewing their VMware licenses if they're not using the entire VCF suite, which of course is Broadcom's plan, is to only care about large organizations using the entire VCF suite. That's what they said from the beginning. One of the parallels I'll see in this is some of what we're seeing from both Morpheus and Oxide, and they both are providing a cloud automation layer on top of something. For Morpheus, it's on top of the KVM distribution that they started showing us, in fact, at a Cloud Field Day a few months ago, prior to the acquisition by HPE. I actually thought that Morpheus and Oxide together would be awesome, because then you would have this layer that makes your hybrid cloud from both on-premises and public cloud homogeneous. And I thought that was something that would be great for Oxide. Turns out it's going to be great for HPE, and HPE would want to give you that homogeneous experience across your cloud and hybrid cloud environment. So that's very much what I'm expecting to hear from our friend Brad Parks as he comes in and presents that cloud vision from HPE. And I think it resonates with companies to be able to use those same tools, to be able to choose where this application belongs, whether the cost that we see as we're putting applications into the public cloud, we get that far more variable cost. And per gigabyte second of compute resource, it's going to be a higher cost than the cost per gigabyte second of compute resource in your own data center. It's just that you only pay for what you tend to only pay for what you use on the cloud versus on premises, you're buying it up front. So there's definitely a cost dynamic in there to work out where is the right place to put this application. I've had customers going back at least 15, 20 years wanting to have that conversation, is being able to have a single place where your internal resources can choose this particular application has these characteristics in this data set, because that also there's some governance requirements and some data sovereignty. Having a single location where my architects and application developers can just say, here are the criteria that I have for this application, put it where it belongs, not having to care whether that's on premises or on which of the public clouds. That vision is still not quite here for us.
No, and I think, like you said, I think one of the keys moving forward, especially with the Morpheus acquisition and HP VM Essentials that they're most likely going to be showing us during the HPE portion, is going to be that commonality of the control plane, basically, where the developers put the rubber to the road, so to speak. And as long as they can get the developers to buy in, yeah, because at the end of the day, I mean, it's not exactly AWS, it's not exactly GCP or Azure, but you get to control everything and still give that developer the experience that they're expecting for your business, essentially, because what the developer works on, business outcomes come from it. So giving them the keys to the kingdom, it still satisfies the needs, but you've got to have that control plane. And without it, you're not going anywhere that's why you've seen so many different stacks fail. Although one could argue OpenStack has kind of zombified and brought itself back from the ground with these Broadcom discussions. But you're seeing this diversification, which meaning as long as the developers can access what they need, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and I think this brokering thing that you're talking about, Alastair, this notion of like, almost making the developer not necessarily have to worry about where the workload is running. Like it could go in the on-premises estate, it could go in the cloud. Having a broker to make those decisions, either via human intervention or via automation is, I think, where we want to be headed. I know that's something things that we're working on in my day job around that, right? And I think the missing piece for the on-premises side is you talked about cost, right? It's very clear and easy to see what I'm going to pay in the cloud to run a workload up there. Engineers, at least in my company, tend to view that on-premises stuff as free, right? Because it's already bought and paid for, right? And there needs to be a little more education and kind of changing that mind shift around this notion that it's free when it's on-prem, because I do think being able to identify what those costs are and kind of being able to compare on a workload basis what it's going to cost to run it on-prem versus in the cloud is something that we need to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole collection of the infrastructure pieces and infrastructure governance that developers shouldn't need to care about. As Jon says, their job is to write features that improve the business within the application. They shouldn't need to care that maybe there's some governance constraints, maybe there's some latency challenges to making their application work correctly if it's on-premises mainframe data being extracted out to cloud. Developers tend to not want to know about that unless they're forced to have a deep experience of a developer team who were taught about bandwidth but were never taught about latency. And so they optimize their application to run on minimum bandwidth. But they did that by sending thousands of tiny requests, which meant that latency absolutely killed the performance of their application. So the more we can make these things part of our platform, and maybe platform engineering is a topic we might want to kick into a little, make these decisions either automated or, as you say, sometimes human decisions still play a pretty big part in this, but wrapping around governance and performance designs and all of those elements that developers don't need to particularly think about or shouldn't need to think about, but are absolutely vital for the success of the business. And this minimizing risk, essentially, and a lot of governance is around minimizing risk. And so these things should be codified, and they should be managed by policy, and they should be automatically applied. If we're leaping back to virtualization n minus 6, wherever we were at with n as the virtualization number, we'd be leaping back to the days where that was not even thought of. And as you say, Mike, the internal cloud has zero incremental cost for the next workload until you get to the $50,000 virtual machine that requires another virtualization host, the $100,000 virtual machine, the $40 million virtual machine when you need to build another data center. And having some accounting for those real costs is one of the things that we've often not seen in on-premises.
Well, I don't want to turn this into an AI discussion, but AI is forcing the conversation about costs in a data center. And it's doing it to a lot of the components that you said would take, developers would take for granted because it was free. Power is not necessarily free, so we have to worry about where's the power coming from, cooling, kind of back to infrastructure 1.0 days all over again, where we've got to worry about these things and they have to be factored into the cost of the overall application development cycle at the same time. So score one for AI for bringing that back to the forefront yet again. But even if you may not believe in the long-term viability of AI inside of a data center, it's sparking some conversations based off of what a corporation would necessarily own within those four walls.
And I think AI is also very much the trigger for those $40 million new data center discussions, because when you look at the power delivery and the cooling delivery in older generation data centers, we're seeing an environment where you can only put two AI hosts with massive GPUs in a rack, because that's all the power you can deliver into that rack and that's all of the cooling you can deliver. The cost, the incremental cost for the new data center to be able to accommodate dozens, hundreds, thousands of GPUs is going to be massive. And I think, I don't recall if it was before the recording, but neoclouds came up as that's a business opportunity for people to deliver you a GPUs as a service or AI as a service that is, again, your own tenancy on somebody else's cloud. And again, brings more of that hybridity, and hopefully we're going to get the same kind of APIs and tool sets for pushing applications out onto neoclouds that we're using to choose to push them to existing clouds or to a hybrid or our on-premises clouds. Once again, things keep changing so fast, it's hard for us to get to that nirvana state where everything just works.
We'll never get there. It's always going to be inching our way closer asymptotically, but we'll probably never actually get there. I think your point about the data center, again, it kind of ties back to the repatriation conversation as well, right? It's like, for most companies, does it make sense to build data centers to run these things for, unless you're a very large LLM creator, right? Does it make sense for you to be building this in your own environment? Or even though it may cost you more on a monthly basis, you eliminate a lot of the risk when you're going with a actual cloud provider versus building this in your own data center.
True, but I do argue, let's take the EU as an example. They're big on sovereignty. Data has to stay in a particular location. So unless you can privatize those links to those particular public instances, like OpenAI and those particular components, you're not going to be able to get to a lot of enterprises to specifically adopt those without having to put something on-prem. Or they're going to have to build their own MSP, which, let's call it what it is. It's their own private cloud at that point. So it's 6 and half a dozen of another, but it's basically having these conversations. But at the same time, we're at least having the conversations again, full circle, to bring everything back around where we're now, as mentioned, in infrastructure 4.0, virtualization 4.0, whatever 4.0.
I think one of the things we do see is that there's a diversity of choices for large to medium organizations. Absolutely, Mike. Some are building this on premises. Some are stuffing their data centers full of liquid-cooled racks of servers in order to be able to get that density. And one of my local companies here was a fertilizer producer, and they create sulfuric acid or use sulfuric acid in that process, and that generated a lot of excess heat. They generated their own power on site from their own waste energy. And that has a parallel we saw at AI Infrastructure Field Day. We saw neoclouds having a couple of sort of points of difference. To Jon's point, data sovereignty, sovereign clouds, having a cloud that has only a presence within, let's say, France, to be compliant with the French requirement that you keep all French business data on French soil. Or that are having more of a green view of being closer to that waste energy. We saw at AI Infrastructure Field Day placing data centers close to where there's waste gas being burned off at a natural gas extraction. There are a variety of different use cases for these neoclouds, but we also have seen tools for building a cloud-like infrastructure on top of your own hardware in your own data center. And Rayfay comes to mind as being at the last AI Infrastructure Field Day, showing us that automation for building up that multi-tenant infrastructure that's consumable as a service, either inside your own enterprise data center or as the way the neoclouds are building these things up. We keep coming back to needing a unified way to access the different types of resources that are available. It's no longer just we're going to be a cloud first on one particular cloud, and all we have to know is that one cloud. Now it's becoming much more of we're going to be in a hybrid and complex environment. We're going to put some things on Google because they're better for maybe the DeepMind team has produced better AI tools for us. We're going to put other things on Azure because, well, Microsoft knows Active Directory, Entra ID far better than we do. Will be spread across multiple places, and that's huge amounts of complexity to manage. But we're also still finding that there's a lot of use cases where on-prem makes the most sense.
Well, that was kind of the promise of Kubernetes, right? Was that you would not have to worry about where it was running. You could use the same model wherever you were deployed. I think people are seeing, as we grow more maturity, that has its own layer of complexity and expense associated with operating that, right?
Yeah, so much expense on the management side, but still, I go back to layer one. There's still a physical infrastructure that has to run all that stuff at the same time. So, you're talking about making standardization across your vendor portfolios and things like that. That again, large enterprises and MSPs are always having those discussions to be able to figure out what pound for pound, what they can get the best out of each dollar that they invest in those particular devices.
I would also want to just circle back to one of the things that we talked about earlier with the repatriation and whether it's real. And Mike's comment about whether just the very large organizations are doing that repatriation to on-premises, because one of the elements I definitely see is the bigger the bill, the more incentive there is to optimize that bill. If you're spending $10,000 a month, if you save 10%, that's a grand a month. That's nothing to be sneezed at. But if you're spending $2 million a month and you can save 10%, it moves a much bigger needle. So I do see some cases where people choose not to optimize because the cost of analyzing to optimize, whether you're running on premises or in the cloud, the cost of analyzing to optimize is greater than the possible return. You don't want to get stuck in that situation where you're spending more money trying to optimize the system than you can save from the system. It's one of those interesting challenges as you change scale.
What I've seen, I'm pretty involved in the FinOps community, and what I've seen is it's moving, the discipline is kind of expanding beyond cloud, and now there's a lot of discussion of like, well, how do we do FinOps for that on-premises equipment, or how do I do FinOps on my SaaS estate, right? There's this notion of like, we've had a lot of good success with building those concepts for the cloud use, and how do we take those same things and extend them to the on-prem infrastructure and make sure we're using it optimally? I think the AI and ML is an area where repatriation has more traction just because of the frightening cost of running these things in a regular public cloud.
Yeah, we definitely see that transition from experimentation in the cloud to a maturity where you realize the ongoing cost, the month in, month out cost for all of your use cases is going to start multiplying that cloud, because you're paying for everything you use. That's the joy of the cloud, right? You pay only for what you use, but the terror of the cloud is that you pay for everything you use.
But that gets back to my point about visibility of what it actually costs to run things on-prem, right? Because I think, again, there's this assumption that it's kind of sunk cost, or it's once you pay for it, it's free. But that doesn't take into account the cost of the power to cool the data center that it's running in, or the cost of the electricity to drive the servers, or the cost of the facilities people that you have to operate that, who may or may not be great at running data centers, right? So those are all things that they're very fuzzy and hard to quantify compared to a cloud bill where everything's spelled out at the individual line item. So I think there just needs to be a lot more work in that area and recognizing what those actual costs are of the on-prem.
Yeah, and that's a continuation of a discussion we had when cloud was new, when people were, IT organizations were trying to be the department of no and saying you can't shift it to the cloud, and saying that pennies per hour that you're getting is not comparable to what we're spending millions of dollars per year on premises. Well, I think it's probably time for us to wrap this up, because all of us need to get ourselves ready to travel to Cloud Field Day next week. So thank you all for joining us today on the Tech Field Day podcast. But before we go, where can people connect with each of you and maybe carry this conversation on, Mike?
Yeah, so of course you can find me on LinkedIn, where I go by my given name, Michael Graff. But you can find me there. I also have a blog that I run called Cloudy Advice. So if you want to check me out there, you can connect with me, and love to carry on that conversation.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. Pretty active these days, especially since the independent contractor portion of the day job. And I've actually made the jump from X to Blue Sky. You can find me at snookj.com as far as the username is concerned.
And of course, you can find both Mike and Jon's profiles on the Tech Field Day website, particularly if you look at the Cloud Field Day 24 event. I, of course, am Alastair Cooke, the event lead for Cloud Field Day 24, and you can find me on all kinds of social media and around the web, either as Alastair Cooke or as Demitas NZ. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast. And if you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast application so you don't miss an episode. Give us a rating, nice review as well. That always helps to get us in front of more people who might benefit from this conversation. This podcast was brought to you by Tech Field Day, the home of IT experts from across the enterprise and a part of the Futurum Group. For upcoming events and more episodes, head to techfieldday.com/podcast or view us on TechStrong TV. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week.